Hi everyone, my name is Darren Grant and welcome to my presentation on how to give a good research presentation. This is my son and daughter on a hike in Colorado several years ago, and they're out in front as they usually were at that age, even though they actually don't know the way. To my wife and me, we're just hiking a trail to the top of a ridge, but to them, we are mountain climbing. Mountain climbers need hiking sticks, which they each have. And if you'll notice, our daughter is skipping. Most of us, when we make a research presentation, think to ourselves, well, I'm going to tell the audience what I'm investigating and how it fits into the literature and what my methods are, and then my results and conclusions. But that is the wrong way to think of it. You're in trouble from the start. Because just like mountain climbing, a presentation is a journey. And I think this picture embodies what we should aspire to achieve in this journey. First, there is the destination, the ultimate question that the researcher is trying to answer. We want this destination to be intriguing and appealing, to call to the audience as the mountain calls to our kids. But if you start your presentation with, well, this is what I'm going to do, and this is how it fits into the literature, and so on, you really haven't properly established your destination, but you have drained your talk of some of its appeal. Next, there's the path that leads to your destination. This path is your slides, which should involve the audience and draw them along. To do this, they must have something for the audience to grab hold of, so to speak. Otherwise, you relegate the audience to passive observers who must be pulled forward along the path instead of eagerly proceeding down it on their own. And finally, there is you, the presenter, the host, the guide on this journey. And that is the last thing this picture shows us by omission. Our kids are out in front, taking in the wonder of it all, while the hosts, my wife and I, we are leading from behind. We don't want to be out in front, obscuring the view and draining away some of the excitement of exploration. So it should be, metaphorically, for your talk as well. The 3 keys to a good presentation that I'm going to discuss in this talk will show you how to turn your presentation into a journey. The first key helps you properly establish the destination. The second key helps you lay down a path that draws in the audience. And the third key delineates your role in the process and shows you how to lead from behind. So let's get started. So here you are at the introductory part of your talk, a moment that is pregnant with possibilities, but also the moment when many presentations falter, never to recover. You want to have a clear objective in mind, and that objective is this: you are trying to establish the destination for your journey. If you started with, this is what I'm going to do, and this is how it fits into the literature, then you're not impelling the audience forward, but dragging them behind you to a destination that they haven't bought into, but have merely been told about. So instead, let me suggest another way. And rather than just tell you what that is, I'm going to show you by introducing another talk that I've given from the past. This slide and every slide that I will show you is from presentations that I've given myself. So here, I just start with the data. You've been looking at this slide the whole time I've been talking. Are you bored or intrigued? Just staring at it, questions quickly come to mind. So then I can launch into a description of this data, the scatter plot, the A, B, C, D, F grading system used in all 5 instructors' courses in this study. And then I can draw the audience's attention to borderline students, say those with a 79 average going into the final exam. And then I can establish my destination by asking a simple question. So what do you think? Do you think that these students tend to perform especially well on the final in order to finish the class with a B instead of a C. Now, I don't answer this question at this point in the talk. I just pose it and broaden it to a more general question about the incentive effects of grades in general. So the destination is set, the audience is intrigued, maybe trying to look at that slide and look at the horizontal, that's your average going into the final, and then the vertical is your exam score on the final, and trying to see what the relationship is there. And then before proceeding, I will affirm that this data will suffice to answer my question, and I sketch out just intuitively how I will use it to do so. So then one slide into my talk, I've hooked you on the topic of my study, and I've acquainted you with the data I use to investigate it, and in broad terms with the methods that I will use as well. And all of this with a scatter plot from Excel. So what did I just do? What is the general principle here? Well, it is that your introduction should create a gap in knowledge that you are then going to fill. This follows the gap theory of curiosity, which is that if you have this gap in knowledge, that generates curiosity. It draws people in. And then in the process of creating this gap, you both introduce the topic and you motivate your research question. The previous slide did this simply by showing the data, but there are many ways to accomplish this goal. Now, in order to have a gap, you have to have material that surrounds the gap. You can't have a gap in nothing. This material consists of prior knowledge, contextual information, and descriptive facts. Use it to develop, to construct almost this gap in knowledge. This gives your audience something to hold on to work with as you move through your talk. To create a gap in knowledge, you must properly set the stage, and that means providing the appropriate intellectual context, institutional context, and even descriptive context in terms of basic facts or descriptive statistics. The gap in knowledge that arises out of this context is far more meaningful and thus more interesting than an abstract question that is posed without it. Finally, recognize that a gap in knowledge is not equivalent to a gap in the literature. A gap in knowledge is more intuitive, it's more substantive, and it's also more organic. You have to come out of the weeds and all the details of your study and relate to your audience in a simpler, more natural way. This is very important for presentations and also for promoting your research generally. You will need to add some detail about the literature in your talk, depending on the topic and your audience and what have you, but this should always come after you establish the gap in knowledge and can often be done in a way that does not bore listeners or drag them behind you, as we will see later in this talk. Now, let's look at some other ways to create a gap in knowledge. So here is another somewhat unconventional way to introduce a talk, and that is to start with the results. The question that comes to mind then becomes, well, how did you get that surprising result? The usual literature review is also inverted. You point out your surprising finding first with the promise that eventually you'll show why it differs from the previous findings in the literature. The verbal part of this presentation would begin like this. My study, like several before it, is spawned by the famed Alcoa antitrust case of 1945. Alcoa was a monopolist in virgin aluminum that is created from scratch out of bauxite, which is its ore. Its only competition came from a competitive recycling sector that produced secondary or recycled metal. To some extent, however, Alcoa could mitigate the pro-competitive effect of this secondary market by restricting its earlier sales of virgin If it sells less virgin at time t, then there'll be less recycled metal at some time, t plus 5 years into the future or t plus 10 years into the future. So this issue, called the recycling problem, was key to the antitrust case and motivated several previous analyses of it. However, the recycling problem had in fact been in a steady state for 2 decades prior to this case and was no longer relevant. Because of fundamental modeling flaws, this essential fact went unrecognized in all previous studies of this problem. So now the audience is invested in the details of modeling the recycling problem, since I have shown, or at least asserted, that they are quite consequential. And then after I've established this destination, I would use this graph to set the stage for the remainder of the paper. I would introduce the main variables in the recycling problem, which you see up there on this graph: prices and demand growth and market shares, stuff like that. I would establish what the steady state meant theoretically in terms of the model, and also empirically in terms of observed variables. I would provide the context needed to understand the question and my analysis up front, equipping the audience for the nitty-gritty details to follow, the technical modeling issues that distinguish this paper from its predecessors. Now, that previous study was largely theoretical, yet it could still be factually motivated. This time, let's flip the script and introduce an empirical paper using theoretical content. Here, I do this by using equations as visuals and asking a simple yet intriguing question: what is the essential difference between these two formulas? From there, the conversation flows naturally. The top equation is less general, but quite intuitive. We know it well, the natural linear pricing heuristic that we all teach our majors. The markup is inversely related to the elasticity of demand. Conveniently, this equation can be directly applied to data. Now, that's definitely not true for the far more general, but also far more complex equation on the bottom. I don't even know what most of the symbols in this equation mean. There are lots of multi-product pricing heuristics too. Tying arrangements, bundling, two-part pricing, etc., yet none of them drop right out of this equation. And eventually, we, in the discussion, arrive at the answer to my question, at least for the purposes of this paper. The top formula allows you to test a pricing heuristic directly. And you can't do that with the formula on the bottom. So how then can we examine the use and relevance of these pricing heuristics in a multi-product context? Now, this is obviously a relevant question. Most price-setting firms sell multiple products, and many use pricing mechanisms that are highly nonlinear. So there's your destination. And then I just promised the audience that this paper will put forward a simple natural technique that can be used with limited data and little theoretical guidance. And then we get down to business. So looking back over the previous slides, notice that in all 3 openings, I never just out and tell the audience what I'm going to do. This isn't because I'm being coy. They will find out quite soon, but because it is not essential to my key purpose here, which is to establish the destination for my talk. My empirical findings, my theoretical results, all that stuff will come soon enough. But first, we have to thoroughly establish the question. We have to create the gap in knowledge that the study is then going to fill. Okay, so now your destination is established and you have the audience's interest. They've started to walk down the path ahead of you toward that destination. But what about the journey itself? How do you hold the audience's interest as you move into the body of your talk and have them continue to push ahead down the path toward that destination? The key is not gimmicky, not humor, not bells and whistles, nothing like that, but substantive, as I will now show you. Making it work involves the presence of one thing and the absence of another. So your narrative is probably causal in some way, shape, or form. You are exploring, theoretically, empirically, or both, how some variable or set of variables influences some outcome or set of outcomes. Now your presentation isn't just a journey, but a quest, kind of like in The Hobbit, except that you're seeking not treasure, but the hidden connection between the variables of interest. So you should structure your presentation to draw the audience into this causal quest with you. Let your slides lay out a path that your audience can follow with some help on their own. And then your causal quest becomes theirs too. Now, just how you do this depends on the content of your narrative, of course. But in general, this can be accomplished by making your slides kinetic, by giving them movement. By this, I don't mean little stick creatures that move around or whatever. Let's not do gimmicks of any kind. Rather, present information in such a way that viewers can search for or draw causal connections on their own. In the process of doing so, they are moving down the path towards your destination of their own volition. And all you have to do is provide reinforcement for those people who are on track and some guidance for those who aren't. The previous slides were each constructed that way. They encouraged you as the viewer to think about the material being presented and to figure things out on your own. The first slide about grades makes you wonder about the relation between the x and y variables. The second slide makes you wonder what the missing word is, the word gap. The third slide about aluminum invites you to draw connections between the different time series presented on that graph, while the fourth slide invites you to compare two different ways of thinking about pricing. This was no accident. In each case, I carefully designed the slide to accomplish this goal. Kinetic slides arise from careful design. Furthermore, if you make good slides, you won't need many, which is okay since your paper has the details on everything and the number of attention-disturbing transitions is reduced. When you first saw that slide 1 of 51 on my first slide that I began the presentation with, you groaned inside, didn't you? Fortunately, there aren't 51 slides in this presentation at all. I have seen some decent presentations with many slides, but let there be no question who's in front on that journey. The presenter is, with the audience just racing to try to catch up and not get left behind. My ballpark for a 22-minute presentation is 10 slides tops. For an hour-and-a-half talk, I aim for 15 slides. Only rarely should you need more. Is it really necessary to include all these details in your talk? Your paper has the details. Nonetheless, the quantity of slides is less important than their quality. So let's look at some slides that are designed to draw you in. So this slide summarizes a good-sized literature on an important drunk driving law in the United States that sets a per se blood alcohol limit of 0.08. And boy, oh boy, is it kinetic. Now this slide is laid out very carefully. It is clear and self-contained. Everything you need to know about the graph is reported right there on the slide, so you can start interpreting it immediately. It is very informative using 5 features: color, bubble size, X location, Y location, and the little black rings around some of the bubbles. So it uses 5 features to convey information, and that facilitates the search for causal connections. Furthermore, it provides contextual information to help you interpret the patterns that you see. And then, after examining the details, you can step back and look at the big picture. You can see that the estimated effect falls shortly after the congressional mandate, whatever that is, and I would describe it in the verbiage accompanying this slide. So is that a causal thing, or is it just accidental? Or does it have anything to do with study design, which you can see changes at about the same time? And shoot, the more recent results are practically nil. Does that mean that these .08 laws don't really do much in the end? So in the actual talk, after I discussed this slide, I would show similar slides for two other major drunk driving laws, both of which contain broadly similar patterns. So then the question naturally arises, what is driving these patterns? So these slides motivate your talk and review the literature in one fell swoop. For the purposes of this presentation, it wasn't necessary for me to go through a laundry list of studies, one lousy bullet point at a time. The big picture is what matters. Well, here it is. Increasingly, I don't even use tables to display my results in a presentation. The results are in the paper in depth. There's no need to recreate them all in your slides. Later, I will show you an alternative way to display results that I prefer when it is feasible. Nonetheless, most of us will use tables from time to time. When I do, I structure them carefully. Here is one such table for zero tolerance drunk driving laws, which apply only to youth age 15 through 20, but not to anyone 21 and older. Just as before, this slide is clear and self-contained. It only displays estimates for key variables, which is really all you need here. Note the use of large type, italics, and color to increase readability, along with the absence of extraneous decimals. This slide respects the resolution of the medium and doesn't include more information than the reader can clearly see and interpret. Cluttered slides with too many decimals and unnecessary coefficient estimates and tiny fonts, stuff like that, those exceed the resolution of the medium and actually reduce the amount of information that is received by the audience. The clarity of this slide facilitates comparison making, as does its layout, which almost begs you to compare the estimates for youth and adults, for daytime and nighttime. This is kinetic and underscores the essential point made by this paper, which is that omitted variables are seriously biasing the base estimate at upper left in white. As you examine this slide, you can start to figure that out for yourself. In doing so, you are taking off down the path towards our shared destination. This slide here just contains background details. No theory, no empirics. Yet even here, good design can structure your ideas and provide, in essence, a path that your audience can follow in making causal connections. In this talk, as for most empirical papers, it is important to provide some institutional context, some background details of the situation that you're going to be analyzing with your data. Now here, the situation is quite unusual. It is a 100-mile ultra marathon out in California. The race sure is kinetic, and so is this slide that describes it. It comprises both a course map and a timeline. It shows movement, provides structure, and conveys a lot of information quickly. It's a lot more interesting than bullet points. In discussing it, I introduce an idea that is made more concretely later in the presentation. There is a qualitative difference between the first 6 splits of this race and the last 4. And so you can actually think of the race as unfolding in 2 stages: the start through the 6th split, and then from the 7th split to the finish. And so if you introduce that idea here, where it's easily seen contextually, you can see differences in the elevation, and in the hilliness, and in the amount of sunlight, whether it's daytime or nighttime, and whether you have pacers allowed. So there's a lot of qualitative differences
between those two parts of the race. So you introduce that idea here where you can easily see it contextually, and then that makes it go down much easier when I show the empirical results that confirm it numerically. Okay, so now we've got the destination, and we've got the audience rushing down the path that you have laid to your destination. So where do you fit in? Are you needed at all? Well, of course you are, but you don't need to be front and center metaphorically speaking. You do need to be in front of the audience physically, of course, but metaphorically, you don't need to be in front of them and pull them along behind you. That's not enjoyable for anyone. But that is exactly what you will do if your slides and your talk are redundant. If your slides are words, and you just read out the words, you've left the audience with no room for discovery. They're boxed out, and all they can do is listen passively to you. But if you have kinetic slides that propel the narrative instead, then you can serve almost as a guide, showing the audience around something they already wish to explore. You don't have to be in front. You can lead from behind. To do this most effectively, eliminate redundancies so that little of what you say is on your slides. That means that words and bullet points should be kept to a minimum, to essential things, background information that you can't really or don't need to discuss, stuff that really can't be conveyed any other way. You're speaking words, so make your slides different. Let them illustrate your ideas. Let them provide structure. Remember, you have the interest of your audience. They want to blast forward down this path you've laid out on your causal quest. So don't get in the way. Don't write a lot of bullet points and then face the screen and read them. Let's be honest. When you do that, you do it for yourself, not for the audience. Bullet points make it easier and more comfortable for you to deliver your talk because everything is just right up there on the screen. But they don't involve the people in the audience. They wall them off instead. Think of it this way. Your spoken words, your slides, and your paper should not be redundant. Instead, exploit complementarities between your spoken words, your slides, and your paper. Your slides provide the structure and information needed for the audience to follow the main thread of your work and draw causal connections. Your paper has the details. So let your talk be different from both. Let it convey the narrative that guides you and your audience forward on your causal quest. Let it elaborate on points that require elaboration. Let it explain the deeper meaning of slide content that you can't pick up at a glance. Now I'm going to show you 3 examples of how to do this. One for the beginning of your talk, one for the middle, and one for the end. The absolute easiest place to get bogged down in your talk, especially a job talk, is in the beginning when framing your question and showing how it fits into the literature. Often a full-blown lit review is neither necessary nor feasible. You don't have the time, it's already in your paper, and it's not vital to creating the gap in knowledge that motivates your research. Remember, a gap in knowledge is not equivalent to a gap in the literature. But if you must do a lit review, do it compactly. We saw this already in the bubbles plot that I showed you a few slides back for these 0.08 laws. And now here's another example. This slide does indeed have words. But look at what it accomplishes. It provides structure, quickly organizing the literature and illuminating its key themes. It lets you address the main points quickly, mentioning occasional details as appropriate. Best of all, discussing it is a breeze. Often, a slide like this can not only review the literature, but also describe where your own study fits in. Perhaps you can place your own study within the table and point out how it differs from others in the same column or even in other columns. My analysis of zero tolerance laws, for example, fell into the 3rd column of this table. but it differed from the other studies in this column by addressing 2 points that appear in the bottom row of the table, one involving theory, the other involving measurement, which accidents to focus on. Thus, in the process of discussing this table, I can introduce the key features that make my paper and its findings different. This slide here pertains to the ultramarathoning paper that we looked at earlier. As simple as it looks, it was not easy to design. It does not come directly from the paper. I made it just for the presentation. It does boil down the theoretical content of that paper into its essence, organizing and illustrating the ideas that I discuss in the talk. This slide sets up 3 theoretical points and 3 econometric points that are essential to the paper. So I spend several minutes here going through them with nary a bullet point in sight. I began laying out the structural parameters, which are described here in words, not symbols, to eliminate confusion. Desire, fatigue, and uncertainty. Each of those is a parameter, and each of those parameters links up to the diagram in front of you. Then I posed the question, where will you find the information that is needed to identify these parameters from data? And so to answer this question, I described the relationship between ability and effort that this slide depicts, tying the sources of information in blue to the 3 structural parameters. Throughout, this slide provides structure and basic information that helps me convey my message and helps my audience understand it. Now, in fact, the full theory and parameter identification for this particular situation are quite mathematical and quite complex. But I don't need to get into that here. That's what the paper is for. Harboring all the nitty-gritty, it complements both the slides and my talk. And now let's look at some results. Previously, I displayed some empirical results with a table, but here's an alternative method that illustrates both results and policy implications without words or numbers. As before, I don't even have to describe this slide at length because it is clear and fully labeled and self-contained. The moment that you see it, you can start taking in my empirical findings and figuring out what they mean. Rather than present a single static coefficient estimate for the effect of these helmet laws, this graph directly shows how these laws impact fatalities. Actual fatalities initially match the no law hypothetical, but then as more and more states begin to adopt helmet laws, realized fatalities plunge further and further below this hypothetical. The coefficient estimate of 13% is actually nowhere to be seen and would simply be mentioned in the talk. And there's no reason to stop there. The policy implications are also in the exact same graph, whose second lower hypothetical, also a dashed line for clarity, estimates what fatalities would be if helmet laws were universal. And so it's easy to see how many additional fatalities would be prevented if the remaining states adopted helmet laws. So I've taken a single static coefficient estimate and turned it into a kinetic display of the retrospective and the prospective effects of the policy that I'm studying, which are bicycle helmet laws for children. This coefficient had, this paper had just one coefficient of primary interest. Now, if you had 3 main coefficients of interest, then you could do 3 of these graphs in quick succession. They're kinetic, they're easy to explain, easy to transition from empirical estimate to policy implication, and if the graphs are all formatted the same way, then the audience can quickly see what you're doing. The structure of the slides propels your narrative forward. But if you had more than 3 coefficients that you really needed to discuss, a sequence of graphs might become unwieldy, and it might make more sense just to use a table. So when you think back across these last 3 slides, they're each quite different, and yet in one way, they're all the same. They are simple. That simplicity helps your verbal presentation too, by making these slides easy to explain. There are no complex equations to parse out, no variables in Greek letters to explain or remember what they stand for, no dense tables to unpack. And when your slides are simple like this, it becomes easier for you to be an engaging host and a good tour guide. In the end, well-designed slides don't just help your audience, they help you by making it easier for you to give your talk. My friends, a presentation is a journey. To make that journey as satisfying as possible to the audience and to you, the presenter, don't drag your audience behind you, which is what you will be doing if you have lots of slides with long lists of bullet points and you turn and face the screen and read them. When we do that, we put a protective cushion around ourselves, which may give us comfort, but which also insulates us and isolates us from our audience. Their interest flags and their attention wanders. Instead, give you and your audience a chance to connect. It is thrilling to stand before them, draw them in with the gap in knowledge that you create, observe their peering interest as they decipher causal connections in your slides as you guide them to the satisfying conclusion of your narrative. I'm not going to lie. The first couple of times, it can be scary. Without bullet point laden slides, your crutch is gone. But you still have support. The structure of your talk, contained in your slides, is going to help you. The opening, creating a gap in knowledge, will rarely be technical, so you can start on territory that is comfortable for you and your audience. Identifying the core point of your talk and phrasing it as a question as a gap in knowledge that needs to be filled, and then designing slides to motivate that question, well, that's not easy. But once you've done so, those slides will help you start strong and connect with your audience. And then the rest of your talk, slides with graphs or pictures or simple tables, okay, discussing those isn't too hard. And you don't have lots of slides to cover because each slide is quite informative and you've left out extraneous material which is in your paper. So now you can slow down a little bit. You can relax, exude some natural enthusiasm, be approachable, relate to your audience. Who knows? You might even enjoy yourself a little. We live in a world of ideas. So let's make that world as fascinating as we can. Why should we settle for anything less?